Welcome to the 2022 Annual Peace Trust Lecture. In recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, we'd like to acknowledge the Moanina people, the traditional owners of the land on which we gather. We acknowledge and pay our respects to all Palawa and Australian First Nations people who have survived invasion and dispossession and continue to maintain their identity and culture. Today, our Peace Trust lecturer, I'm proud to tell you, is Katrina Munting, who is a colleague and friend, who is going to speak to us today about her experience. I know her as a very talented teacher and colleague, but she's here to speak to her experience in her life of a journey to inner peace, in particular in her role as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. Katrina.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Maddie has so nicely introduced me, I'm Katrina Munting. I have the privilege of delivering this year's Peace Trust lecture. Some of you already know part of my story. However, I hope today sheds a slightly different light on what you already know. I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land at which we meet today, the Munting people. On this beautiful island, Lutuita, I pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging. They are the holders of deep history, culture and practices. This beautiful land, which they should never have been denied, and we now respectfully walk alongside. Thank you to the Peace Trust for inviting me to give the annual Peace Lecture. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share a portion of my story today and how that links to my journey to inner peace. I'd like to let you know that some of the content I'm going to discuss today might be confronting, might be triggering for some of you. As Maddie said, my story relates to childhood sexual abuse. However, I'm not going to discuss the specifics of that abuse. But at any stage during my lecture. But if you are feeling uncomfortable, if you're feeling upset or triggered, please, if you're able to, please step out. One of our lovely Peace Trust hosts will probably follow you to make sure that you are okay. But if you are like me, you will prefer to sit in your seat and not draw attention to yourself. So breathe, wiggle your toes, take your mind far away from here and my words and come back. When you're ready, you're in a safe space, regardless of my words. Throughout my lecture, I welcome you to ask questions, make comment, and seek further explanations if you wish. But can I ask that you wait until I reach the end of a current portion of my narrative. I'll pause at those moments before moving on, but by all means, instead of waiting to the end, you're more than welcome to ask or make comment along the way. For the majority of people in the room, you don't know me. I wear several different hats, as Maddie alluded to, as you all do as well. I'm a mother of two beautiful young humans, a wife, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a colleague, a volunteer, and a teacher. I currently teach here at the Friends School. But I am a survivor of persistent childhood sexual abuse, which is what brings me here today. So I'd like to start by setting the scene for you, because there is so much more to my life than what happened to me in those times. So in my childhood, I grew up in, we're talking about the 80s. I grew up in what was a fairly traditional nuclear middle-class family. My mum, my dad, elder brother. As a family, we were quite transient due to my father's work. Starting my life in Smithton, moving to Burnie, spent some time in Queenstown, and finally landing in Hobart, in Nibbaluna, in mid-primary school. So it was a fantastic time for me to land here. I was a super dedicated, goody two-shoes student. And for those who know me, that's probably not a surprise to you. I loved school. It was that right mix of sufficient challenge and a whole lot of success. Despite having what I now know was undiagnosed dyslexia. This led me to university, where I continued to thrive academically. I became a qualified chemist, and then as teacher of science and mathematics for years 7 to 12. I was the first in my extended family to graduate from university. This was my sole life goal up until that point as an adolescent. It was this amazing goal that I thought that was unachievable because no one else in my family had even engaged in that in the past. It was a culmination of societal norms and pressures, financial pressures, and geography, where my family came from, relative to university. So for me, it was it. That was what I wanted, come hell or high water. So now to my journey to inner peace. It's not going to be a blow-by-blow account of my life, but there's some pivotal childhood moments that kind of lead to where I am now. That I'm going to highlight to you just so you can get a greater sense of why I am where I am now. So let's start at early childhood, of which there are people in this room that did know me in early childhood. It was a beautiful time for me. Mostly, for me, it's through photos and stories rather than actual memories. I don't have memories from Smithton. I was too young. My memories start to form in Burnie. And the childhood innocence from those stories and those photos, such sweet innocence. Is this actually inner peace? Was I there already? Does that mean my lecture's over? Oh, I found it. Okay. Right. But in retrospect, does life, for me, could life actually get any better? And the answer was no. I had everything I needed, and it was beautiful. Unfortunately, I didn't know that I just hadn't been on the planet long enough to know it different. And then as let's fast forward a little while to where I was 4 and 5, so I'm now living in Burnie. And I have real memories of my own of this time period. So 4 or 5 years of age, kindergarten, for those of you who are not in education, and what should have been a continuation of that very sweet, innocent childhood. However, for me that wasn't the case. I was sexually abused on multiple occasions by a somewhat distant relative in terms of the family tree branches, but geographically and socially quite close to my family. Just for perspective, he was 11 years older than I was. So he too, technically, was still a child. Is this where childhood innocence and inner peace is destroyed? Well, technically, yes. I've been exposed to actions that no young person should have to endure. But in reality, the answer is no. And that might seem really strange. I actually had no idea that what was happening to me was abnormal or wrong. It was just a secret. It's that childhood naivety. It's just a secret. So I still had inner peace, essentially, because I knew no different. Let all of us reflect on the broader societal norms of the time of, the late 1980s. Even if I did know what was done to me was wrong, had I had the ability to speak, what would have happened? I fear the answer is nothing. Would I have been believed? Would anyone have acted? This was very much a time of not airing one's dirty laundry in public. That's probably my grandmother speaking to me. Behind closed doors, it would have stayed still a skeleton in the closet, where it remained anyway. It's a very different time. Moving through primary school, the more I learnt about the human body, the good old birds and the bees, I started to get this sense of what happened to me was actually not normal. And it was wrong. Now this is where childhood innocence and inner peace was starting to erode. I was abnormal in my experience. What was just a secret was now a big secret. And no one could know. I couldn't discuss what happened to me with anyone. I was so ashamed. But what do you do? What can you do? For me, it was really simple. For a long time, it was ignore it, deny it, deem it not important. I loved life. I loved school. That's past. And learning was my present. So I held on to that. Apologies. Moving through high school, academic achievement and perfectionism took my focus, and again, those of you who know me, that's not a surprise. I was the epitome of a teacher's pet. I craved their approval, their respect, their recognition of my effort and my ability. While my focus had shifted, had inner peace actually been restored? No. My past didn't fade. I just had much more taking my attention. It became somewhat obscured. To focus within this phase of my education, from 14 to 16 years old, so I was in year 9, year 10, there was another layer of complexity to my journey to inner peace, which some of you already know. I was unknowingly vulnerable. I had a dark secret that still no one knew. No one. I also had some additional medical issues to negotiate. And what was already a tumultuous time of adolescence. We've all been there, and quite a number of people in the room spend a great deal of time with adolescents and young people. And it's a really difficult time to negotiate. I'd become increasingly anxious about my academic performance, my future, thinking about that goal of being the first person to university, wearing the cool hat. I had really high expectations of myself. And what if I couldn't get there? I had that goal for so long. What if I couldn't get there? Unbeknownst to me, my abuser had cast his net wide over a particular demographic of my year group. I was in that net. Somehow he narrowed in on me. Somehow he knew that I was vulnerable, despite never being taught by him or having any prior associations or conversations with him within the school. How did he know? The grooming began, I had no idea, totally ambivalent to all such things. Childhood innocence and the naivety had reared its head again, but from a different perspective. While I've used the term adolescence, let's not forget for a moment that I was still a child. He gained my trust over time. I confided in him about my academic anxiety, plans for the future. The grooming continued and intensified. Over about 15 months, I was sexually assaulted to varying degrees. From brushing past inappropriately to rape. 1, 2, 3 times a week at any opportunity that presented itself, or by his demand. I conformed. Why did I conform? As always, I did what teachers said. I was that teacher's pet, much to my demise. I wouldn't dare speak up against them. It was an imbalance of power. It was an abuse of power. Apologies. All of us in the room have heard of the fight, flight, freeze, fundamental survival responses. And I didn't display any of those. There's one more though, which has joined that series. Lesser known, it is to fawn. That was me. For self-preservation and survival, I fawned. I had to conform in the face of threat to survive. Now, this sounds familiar. But does it sound familiar to other victim survivors you've heard? Yes, very much. It's really confronting when I found out that that pattern of behaviour wasn't just on me, that's standard. The pattern of behaviour by the abuser and the victim's response is the same for so many of us. While our experiences are unique, the story is still so much the same. It's like there's a book that they, perpetrators, all read on the how-to. It's like a guide, if you will. It's now well documented that what I experienced, like so many others, was actually the 6 stages of grooming. There's actually formal research about this now. For those of you that are unfamiliar, in brief, these stages are targeting, gaining trust, feeling a need, isolation from others, sexualising and maintaining control. And in retrospect, I can pinpoint every single one of those. Isn't hindsight a wonderful thing? So how did I end up here? Again, a victim of repeated sexual abuse for a second time. The foundation had already been laid when I was much, much younger. Without even knowing it, I was an easy target. So much of the groundwork of grooming had already been done years earlier. Those negative thoughts, beliefs, behaviour patterns, I'd already established my perception of power and confirmation to power. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating psychological realm for those of you who get the opportunity to read about it, as I have. However, I digress. Now I had another secret. However, this one was much larger. Once I realised that what he was doing was deliberate and targeting just me. It wasn't just how he was with everyone. This was deliberate, and it was deliberately on me. I was then in too deep. I was trapped. I couldn't see a way out that wasn't going to destroy my life and my reputation. And that entrapment of victims is something that many people don't understand. It's like there's a threshold of severity of what they do to you, and once you pass that threshold, you can't get back out. I was damned through retribution if I spoke up. I was damned if I did not, as the abuse would continue. Again, let us think about the time period. We're now in the late 1990s. It's still a time when speaking of abuse, past or present, was taboo. While so much had changed in that time frame, public perception of this had not. Societal discomfort overshadowed the victim's needs, so denial again was the only option. So what about inner peace? What is that? There was no peace here. Just a nightmare on repeat, and I was never waking up. Fortunately, there were staff at my school who had significant suspicion or knowledge of what was happening to me. I was not safe. Unfortunately for me, they did not intervene. They did not make it stop. What I now know is they were effectively enablers of my abuse. An interesting aside is that mandatory reporting for teachers came into effect in 1998 on the back of the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act of 1997. So there was new legislation that should have helped to protect me. But it didn't. That was laid down before my abuse. It appears they did not report despite being legislated to do so. Like we still are now, and that we do report now. I only speak for myself. Eventually I was confronted by a senior staff member about what was going on. As the victim, as a child, not the perpetrator. My abuser was not made to stop. I had to do that. As a child. I then began taking steps to avoid my abuser, to not conform to his demands, and to eventually make it stop. over a period of a number of weeks. The child, had to stop the abuse. Not the adult who I had trusted to keep me safe. The lies upon lies, secrets upon secrets. Inner peace was now much further away than it had ever been. In retrospect, men, senior staff that I used to admire, I used to look up to so much, I had so much respect for these three men in particular. They left me unprotected at the hands of a monster who had effectively been permitted to continue to abuse me, apparently only being told to watch himself. What does that even mean? Keep doing what you're doing, but do it better because people are noticing? Thankfully, the end of year 10 was nigh. I have to admit, I did cop a fair bit of flack from my abuser at the end of high school because I ceased to conform. Thankfully, the following 2 years, I'd be moving on to college. I would need not be in his presence ever again. I could put it behind me, again, ignore it, deny it. Once more, I could immerse myself in my studies. Inner peace was potentially back in sight. Unfortunately, I didn't get to escape this part of my life as smoothly as I'd hoped. To keep my younger friends and people who are now family members, to keep them safe, I partially disclosed what had happened to me as a small child, but also what happened in high school. I didn't want my younger friends and my now younger sisters in particular to be at the hands of that man. For me, it felt like chaos ensued. I was so ashamed. First of all, how does one have that conversation with their parents? Thinking about the fact that I was in a traditional nuclear family that had quite traditional values. I couldn't do it alone. It was actually quite a team effort. I disclosed to what is now my husband. He told his parents, and all 6 of us, including my parents, met to talk. I remember I spent most of the time with my head hung in shame, and everyone else spoke on my behalf. I'd had enough to tell that once. They then did the speaking after that. So as expected, meetings were had with school, with government representatives. Behind closed doors, even more discussions were had that I was not privy to. When confronted with my allegations, my abuser resigned as an admission of guilt and was to never teach again. Now my abuser was not the government's problem anymore. No investigation ensued, police were not notified, and I was left alone. Again, unsupported by an institution that enabled the crime. Another successful sweep under the carpet moment for the government. Unknowingly at the time, there was a glimmer of inner peace in a dark world, as I had protected others from what I had endured. His access to children had been drastically slashed. This was my first significant step forward in my journey to inner peace. Keep forgetting to stop to let you make comment. Please do. At this point, I entered a long phase of denial. I packed up all my experiences, my thoughts, my emotions so tightly and buried them deep within my brain. They weren't to be disturbed. I threw myself into my studies, volunteering, my hobbies, and then my career with such dedication. There was no space or time to deal with my past. It was easier that way. I consciously decided to abandon my original university pathway and future career. I made it my mission to covertly protect children by becoming a teacher. I jumped through all the academic hoops, nailing my university graduation goal 3 times over in the process. Great funky hat moments. Following my strengths through science, particularly in chemistry. And then ended up where I needed to be. I was a trained Year 7 to 12 maths and science teacher. While engaging in my new career, as everyone can see on the outside, on the inside, I knew that every student in my classroom was safe. If only for the time that they were in my duty of care. For every teacher like me, there was one less opportunity or a position available for a teacher who abuses children. Was this inner peace? It appeared to be a pretty good solution in my head. I could make a difference out of my own darkness. And no one need know. This was just my career. But it was so much more than a career for me. It still is. However, there was a massive time bomb ticking that couldn't stay packed up forever. As time passed, traditional milestones passed. I had a partner, we were engaged, we bought our first house, we got married. I started my career at Friends. We had children. So much joy was had. And that, my past faded again. Or not faded, it was obscured by those moments, those traditional milestones. However, cracks began to emerge in my mental health, which I hadn't considered prior to that. The time bomb was starting to resurface. It was ticking louder. My mental health deteriorated to a point of regular suicidal ideation. Eventually I spoke up and gained professional help thanks to my husband. But that took a lot of time, a lot of damage before I did.